So thank you again to Tom and the team for inviting me to present at this conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, and particularly for including me in such an illustrious lineup of speakers. So as the introduction says, I'm going to talk about 1391, and I fear I'm departing from the general trend towards localism by looking at this whole question of the contagion of violence across the Iberian Peninsula. So I started in the paper by looking at a number of precedent outbreaks, some of them within Iberia and some of them outside, which I think point up the uniqueness of 1391. So mostly these are relatively small numbers of serious attacks, and mostly the mechanism of contagion limits the speed and extent of spread. So if we look at two of these, the Rhineland and the Shepherd's Crusade, most of the violence is committed either by a single group or a few related groups, which obviously is a limiting factor. The Rhineland massacres, for all of their legendary status in Jewish historiography and mythology, spread over less than 250 kilometers in around a month and contained 4 serious attacks. The Shepherd's Crusade, after crossing the Pyrenees through Navarre, arrived in Aragon and Catalonia, but again contained maybe 3 or 4 serious attacks. In 1348, we obviously have a different agency of contagion, but again, we've got a limit on the speed. So whatever the contagion mechanism of the plague itself, whether it was merchants, pilgrims, messengers, or other itinerants traveling between towns and cities, the general speed of spread of the plague is quite slow. On average across Europe, it spread at around 1 to 2 kilometers a day. In Iberia, it arrives in Mallorca in December 1347 and takes around 5 or 6 months to spread across Catalonia, and eventually arrives in parts of the inland areas of Castile, something like 18 months later. The other thing about the precedents is they all have an overarching context, 3 of them some sort of crusade, 2 of them the Black Death, but the local differences probably outweigh the common context. So the attacks in England are quite a good example. They begin at the coronation in September 1189. There's then around 5 months of relative peace before the king departs on crusade in December. And then you get this wave of contagious attacks between February and March 1390. Probably 2 or 3 separate parallel routes, one northwards from King's Lynn through Stamford and Lincoln to York, a distance of about 180 kilometers in 9 days, with a separate route ending up at Bury St Edmunds. The York attack is less about crusade and more about local factors. So the direct cause is a period of conflict between leading local nobles and the crown, combined with power vacuums in ecclesiastic and civil government. And according to William of Newburgh, the chronicler of the time, the opulent lifestyle and extreme wealth of 2 leading Jewish financiers, Benedict and Joske. And the main perpetrators are local knights rather than crusaders. In 1348, we also get a stark contrast between what goes on in Switzerland, Germany, and what goes on in Catalonia. So in Switzerland in November 1348, Jews are accused of, and indeed confess to, well poisoning. Similar accusations seem to drive at least some of the subsequent spate of attacks across Germany in the following 9 months. And of course, the presence of flagellants is important in a number of cases too. In Cologne in August 1349, 4 months, the attack on the Jews takes place 4 months before the first reported plague deaths, which imply that the attacks are a deliberate effort to eradicate the supposed cause of the plague before it arrives. What happens in the Catalan cities is completely different. The attacks on the Jews seem to be spontaneous, around about or following the arrival of Black Death, and with no documented accusations against the Jews. Indeed, in Cervera and Tàrrega, there is a recent history of interethnic conflict between the council and the nobility and the Jews, which is undoubtedly a contributory factor. So of the 5 precedents that I've mentioned there, Germany in 1348 is by far the greatest, most widespread contagion. There's at least 20 attacks of varying degrees of seriousness. the main attacks, which begin in Chillon in Switzerland in November 1348 and end up in Erfurt in March 1349, cover a distance of about 700 kilometers at roughly 6 kilometers per day. But this is absolutely nothing compared with the contagion which takes place in 1391. Here, from the first major outbreak in Seville in June to Perpignan in the middle of August, we have around 1,200 kilometers in linear distance covered in around 10 weeks. That's a minimum speed of 17 kilometers a day. And it's obvious that in some legs, Seville to Cordoba and Valencia to Alzira and Xàtiva, the speed is much faster, 40 or 50 kilometers a day. So we've got a contagion that's pretty much unprecedented in both speed and scale, yet in the absence of an obvious single context to bind together what ends up probably between 50 and 100 separate attacks. It seems pretty clear that such contagion must involve something more than simply a large number of separate but coincident local outbreaks, each with their own dynamics. Something must connect them. And that something might be pointed to by contagion theory. That's a methodological framework we can use to analyze the framework, derived from modern medical theories of contagion, commonly applied to crowd behavior. This gives us 3 stages. The first is the susceptibility of the organism, the initial conditions. The second is the agent of contagion. And the third is the removal or weakening of the normal barriers to contagion. So for the initial conditions, in 1391, there are many candidates. The brewing social conflicts in the major cities that have been written about by Philip Wolff and Jaume Riera and others. But the most interesting is the charismatic preaching of Ferran Martínez that has been described already by Maya. And I want to pick that up and take some slightly different aspects of Martínez's speeches. On the 25th of August, 1383, the king wrote to Martínez at the instigation of the Aljama for claiming that any Christian who killed a Jew would be pleasing the king and accordingly pardoned. The king accuses Martínez of wanting to destroy the Aljama and take what is rightfully theirs, and he commands him to cease his inflammatory preaching. Martínez's reply, which also forms part of the speech of 1388 that Maya described, is that he can't leave off preaching against the Jews because he's simply following Christ's command to his apostles to preach his gospel to all the creatures of the earth, so that those who believe and are baptized would be saved, and those who do not are condemned to the fires of hell. And after various other arguments, theological arguments, he goes on to say that 23 synagogues have been built against the will of God and the law, and they must be pulled down. So what we've got here is the basis of what happens in 1391, both conversionary preaching and the idea of direct violent action against the Jews. And we see this coming out again in Martínez's statement in December 1390. By now, he's acquired power because of the vacancy of the Archbishopric of Seville. He writes to a number of clerics and sacristans in the area, commanding them to destroy the synagogues in their parishes. And if in this you meet any obstacles, you go with force and power. So in other words, violence is to be used to achieve the end. And of course, we know from later documents that these synagogues are destroyed. Exactly what he requires to happen happens. So Pedro de Ayala, the Castilian chronicler and politician, also accuses Martínez of turning his ire against the municipal justices as well as the Jews in the first precursor to the attacks that takes place on Ash Wednesday, March the 15th, 1391. In the events that follow, the Alguacil Mayor and the Count of Niebla are barely able to maintain order. In Ayala's words, the situation is ripe for a fresh outbreak because it was not possible to punish the guilty to prevent further uproar. Rather, it was important to issue public forgiveness. After one particularly violent incident between the mob and the authorities, Ayala claims that not only the people of Seville are roused against the Jews, but that, quote, all of the cities were moved to destroy the Jews. The clear implication here is that the news of these events was quickly disseminated around Castile. After the king and council, clearly under physical threat, withdraw to Segovia on the 27th of May, royal patents are now released, quotes again from Ayala, from Seville, Cordoba and other places, designed to calm the situation. The people were very inflamed and had no fear of anyone, and the greed to rob the Jews grew each day. It's evident that even before the main riots break out in June, the public mood is inflamed not only in Seville, but far beyond. And we've got other pieces of evidence for the dissemination of Martinez's message beyond Seville. Not only Ayala, but also the King Enrique and the Aragonese King Juan all believe, and all are documented as believing, that he instigated the risings throughout Castile. We have the very well-known evidence that in Valencia, the rioters are calling out his name and saying that the Archdeacon of Castile is going to come with his crucifix and the Jews will either die or become Christians. And we have this rather strange incident in February of 1392, where Martinez's nephew is apprehended in Aragon, and the king is so concerned about him that he says that if you can't actually arrest him and bring him to me, he should be killed. So clearly he's a serious threat to the peace. So we've got a number of fragmentary pieces of evidence which tell us that Martinez, although he's not an itinerant preacher beyond Seville, unlike Vicente Ferrer 20 years later, he is a local preacher, and yet his message has clearly traveled far and wide. And this leads us to the question of why is this a deliberate act by those wishing to foment trouble? Is Martinez, does he have a network of like-minded preachers and other Castilians who deliberately carry the message far and wide? What's clear is that even before the outbreak in June, the conditions are primed for widespread attack. And what's interesting is that when the two monarchs respond after the attacks in Seville and Cordoba, they are very mindful of the immediate risk of contagion. So Enrique receives the news of the Seville and Cordoba attacks on the 16th of June. He immediately, on the same day, writes to the leaders of Burgos to tell them to protect their Jews. Now, Burgos is 600 kilometers north of the last reported outbreak in Cordoba. This is an extraordinary degree of contagion that Enrique clearly immediately fears. And Juan acts in exactly the same way. So on the 27th of June, when he receives the news of the attacks in Seville and Cordoba, he immediately raises the alarm throughout his territories, even though at this point there hasn't been a single outbreak of violence in his territory and won't be for another 2 weeks or so. His messages go to Valencia, to Catalonia, and as far north as Rosselló, over 1,000 kilometers from the last reported outbreak in Cordoba. So again, he may be acting just in an abundance of caution, although this is an unusual step, and it raises a suspicion, at least, that populations of Iberia are already aware of the unrest in Castile, maybe from the news that, in March, and that they are themselves perhaps showing signs of unrest. So once the priming has taken place, once the existing discontents are being stirred up, the key element of the contagion has to be the rapid dissemination of news, information, and ideas. And again, this is an extraordinary element of what happens in 1391. Letters reporting violent outbreaks are regularly sent far and wide, either on the day of the violent outbreak or within a very short period. And the information travels at incredibly high speed. Thus, for example, as we've seen, the news of Seville and Cordoba reach Enrique in around 8 to 10 days. That's about 40 kilometers a day. The same news reaches Saragossa and Juan at about 30 kilometers a day. The same thing happens after the attack in Valencia in July. The attack happens at roughly lunchtime on the 9th of July and reaches Xàtiva, which is some 60 kilometers away, by dawn the following day. Clearly, a messenger has been sent out to travel overnight, and immediately violence breaks out in both Alzira and Xàtiva on the 10th, on the day that the news arrives. In Xàtiva, the king's account of the events indicates that the rioters again express their approval of the events in Castile. And the king's account, which is the document on the screen here, is also a very good account of how rumours, whether they're true or false, spread and ignite violence. And again, in Catalonia, the same thing happens. After the Barcelona outbreak of the 5th of August, news reaches Girona, about 100 kilometres away, within 1 or 2 days, and Lleida, about 160 kilometres away, in 3 days or less. And again, attacks break out within a few days. So consistently, we're seeing news travelling about as fast as it can do and triggering near immediate unrest. It seems to me that this travel of news and information is the Yersinia pestis of the contagion. It is the lifeblood of the contagion. Now, of course, famously, there is direct human agency as well. You know, we know of Castilians who, of course, are involved in the rioting in Valencia. Perhaps equally significantly, 50 Castilians are involved in the rioting in Barcelona, of whom 10 are recognized as having been involved in Seville. So clearly there is a group of people who are actually traveling around carrying the message and carrying the violence. But there are a number of other examples as well. So for example, this document here is indicating that 200 citizens marched from Villarreal to Borriana specifically to attack the Jews. So human movement is clearly a factor, although it's probably secondary to the travel of information. Information is traveling everywhere and all the time. The movement of humans is in a limited number of cases. And then the last element of the contagion model is the removal of the normal brakes on contagion. Now, this, of course, is where Gampel's thesis comes in. For Gampel, the crown is the natural defender of the Jews, and the preoccupations and failings of the royal family are the main reason why they are unable, or perhaps in Martí's case, unwilling to fulfill that role. And in the pleadings of the jurats of Valencia, which we see here, royal failings and divine ordination combine to make them powerless. Gampel's case is extremely powerful, but I also think that the spotlight needs to be moved increasingly to the municipal authorities and their own failings. The king, for all of his broken promises to render justice, could never be present at all of the outbreaks, especially given the speed and extent of the contagion. And the regularity and timeliness of his calls to local leaders to defend the Jews not only reflects the limits of his personal power, but also mirrors the action of his predecessors when their aljamas were threatened. So municipal governments is something which has clearly evolved very rapidly during the latter part of the 14th century. This is very well documented, of course, the development of permanent and robust fiscal system around annuities, the censal and the violari, and the farming of imposiciones around the trading of a wide range of commodities. This allows the expenditure and revenue of the municipal treasury to grow dramatically, but also to have a huge debt burden. The impact of Jewish communities of these developments is profound. It's commonplace that the growth in the annuity market, along with the emergence of money changers, effectively supplants the Jews from their, albeit never dominant, role in urban financial markets. The reduced income contributes to the impoverishment of major Jewish communities. But when we look at the archives of Valencia, Barcelona, and Girona, I think it shows us another more important impact, and that is the complete marginalization of the Jews in terms of city finances. They are almost entirely absent from the annuity market, except occasionally as secondary purchasers, and they're almost entirely absent from the farming of imposiciones. Their direct contributions to city treasuries are a tiny overall proportion of revenue. So a few examples serve to illustrate. In Barcelona in 1370, the Jews provide 0.5% of the claveries expenditure budget towards the work on the city walls. 2 years later, the Aljamar contributes rather more, about 260 libras, but it's still less than 4% of the total city budget. Censals, which are obviously taking off at this point, by 1377, there are 136 censal payments to 101 recipients. Only one of those goes to a Jew and accounts for less than 1% of the total. The same thing in the other cities. In Valencia, this new fiscal system allows the municipal budget to grow by 3 to 4 times between 1365 and 1391, driven by royal and ducal demands, and funded again by the sale of censals and the sale of imposiciones. The Jews are completely absent from both of these sources of finance. And finally, in Girona, if you look at the early 14th century, the Jews are major providers of municipal loans as well as royal subsidies, but the new system effectively locks them out. They are quite significant holders of secondary annuities, but they're all acquired through assignment. And in the 1383 censal payment, the Jews, even with these secondary holdings, account for only 3% of all of the censal payments. So this fiscal marginalization of the Jews produces a dilemma for the municipalities. On the one hand, the Jews, particularly in Valencia, are seen as both a physical and spiritual barrier to urban renewal. On the other hand, they offer little positive fiscal value to the claverie. So when the crown comes in 1391 and demands that the municipalities defend the Jews, what happens? Well, not surprisingly, not very much. Some authorities, such as Murcia in Castile, do defend the Jews very effectively, but the big cities are not so effective. In Valencia, famously, not just Martí, but the Jurats do nothing really to defend the Jews at all. Their defenses are completely bypassed and their efforts are limited to assisting in baptism. Things are slightly more complex in Barcelona and Girona. In Barcelona, though, despite weeks of warning, 5 weeks since the king's original letter, a further warning from the Jurats of Valencia of their attack, the CAI is virtually undefended when it's attacked. 100 Jews are killed, the whole area is ransacked, and there is no effective defense. In fact, the guards are placed on the gates to the CAI only the following day. Of course, some of them find their way into the Castellnou, and that now comes under ferocious attack from a revolutionary mob who are attacking not only the Jews, but also the wealthy burghers and the royal officers and an onrat. So, you know, the city's got some excuse that they're under attack from the people, but the efforts to defend the Jewish quarter are non-existent. And I think it's worth noting that in the years that follow, both city authorities strongly oppose the revival of the CAI, which the king is trying to push, which I think underpins their long-term agenda and strategy. Things are slightly more positive in Girona, as we heard in the previous presentation. Some defences are erected, but again, when the CAI is attacked, numerous Jews are killed and there's great damage. The good news, of course, is that those who take refuge in the Torre Gironella, admittedly in return for very substantial payments to the Castellan for their upkeep, are protected and the community survives and is revived. So in summary, a number of the contagious attacks which take place prior to 1391 are limited by the nature of the agency, a single group, or the progress of an epidemic disease, and of course the failure to arouse the wider populace. In 1391, the conditions for contagion are clearly perfect. Whatever the motivations and discontents, which clearly do vary enormously by location, the advanced priming and expectation of mass rising, the rapid dissemination of news and information, the ready flow of individuals, and the extremely weak response of main municipal authorities who are charged with the defense of the Jews are, I think, the engines of contagion. Thank you.